Questions of life, from the Shire to the lonely mountain and everything in between. This is part 5, and I've called it Overwhelmed by the Thought of It All. Have you ever walked into somewhere where you just feel completely overwhelmed and out of your depth? Remember your first day at work or your first day at university, walking around those buildings and just not knowing where you are. It just seems so much bigger than your school. I mean, I remember when I started Sandhurst and just feeling completely out of my depth. There were people there who'd been military kenos for many years. There were guys who'd been soldiers. There were guys who'd been in the university training corps and had dreamed about this day. My life had been about football and friends until that point, and I had no military knowledge. And for the first few weeks at Sandhurst, I just felt completely out of my depth. It was really felt kind of embarrassing because everything was new, and it was overwhelming, and trying to just learn anything felt impossible. And as we look at The Hobbit, this is what I think is happening to Bilbo. He's let Gandalf in, he's had his chat with him, and they're in his hobbit hole talk, and he's mentioned adventure, and Bilbo's very worried about it. And then suddenly all these dwarves start arriving at his house. I'm going to read to you now a part where the dwarves start turning up, and Bilbo's reaction to this. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" said Bilbo, as some of the dwarfs knocked on the door. "Killy, at your service," said the one. "And Filly," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin were here already, I see," said Killy. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just about had a sip in the corner, while the 4 dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous for him. Then the doorbell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Filly. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen and whether they would all stay for supper. Bilbo was completely overwhelmed. Suddenly his peace had been disrupted. All these dwarfs started arriving, and the talk of mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and depredations of dragons is completely different to his peaceful, non-eventful life in the Shire. And so he sits there with his head in his hands and feels completely overwhelmed. And I sometimes wonder if that's how people feel when they come to church for the first time. And maybe that's you. Maybe you feel overwhelmed by the language and the stories that are spoken about from the front and within the congregation. And you're just thinking, I hope they don't ask me to do something that's embarrassing. It's just too overwhelming. I don't even know how to have a conversation about it. And I think for many people, that's where church is, this alien place that's intimidating and overwhelming because maybe you've never been. And I think that what we need to remember is like Gandalf and Bilbo, is that Gandalf cares about Bilbo. He cares about him. And also that Bilbo is going to find friends, but he has to step into it. He's going to have to make a choice of whether he steps into this adventure. And I think that's a bit like that with church. We have to make a choice to maybe feel uncomfortable and be willing to accept being overwhelmed for a while. But in there, you will find there are people who are friendly, who would welcome you. And after time, and if you were to explore the church and the teaching, actually, it's a good thing. And I'd like to just, before I move on, is read something from Peter the Apostle. You may have heard of him. And he writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he might lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. And you see here that under God's mighty hand, that he might lift you up in due time. At the heart of the Christian faith is a God who cares for you and who has a plan for your life. He will lift you up in due time, and he calls us to cast our anxieties on him because he cares for us. If you feel intimidated about walking into a church building or coming to a different kind of church service, I'd like you to remind you that God has a plan for you, and that he will lift you up, and he is able and willing to receive your anxieties, because ultimately the Christian faith, we believe in a God who cares for us. And that's what Bilbo will discover, that in Gandalf is a wizard who cares for him. And although it's not going to be easy, and he's going to feel out of his depth for a long time, that he is given the framework with which to come to actually feel a part of it. The question for Bilbo is, though, will he dare to step out? Will he dare to feel uncomfortable, to go through those overwhelming times for the sake of being a part of something bigger, for the sake of being loved and cared for the sake of discovering a plan for his life? I wonder if that's something that holds you back, and if you would be willing to dare to risk feeling overwhelmed by it all.